In video number 5, we're going to make our API type safe with Hono RPC. We're going to export types from the database schema to our UI through our monorepo structure, so we don't have to manually rely on types that we've created blindly on the UI side. So let's take a look at that. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is work on the API side. Right now, we have this index file that is doing a lot. It's defining our routes, and at the same time, here at the bottom is serving the actual API server. So I created this routes folder here in SRC where we're going to define all our routes. So I'm going to refactor this a little bit by creating a route file for books. And then I am going to move all this code for the routes to our newly created books route, like that. And now I am going to bring all these imports that are needed in my route. Okay, I'm going to paste them up here, fix this import for the schema. And now we're going to rename this books route. I'm going to move this line up here. And finally, at the end of the file, I will export the books route. Then next to this file here in routes, I will create an index file. And in this index file, I will import the books route. And then I will create like a compounded version of all my routes in case in the future we want to add a route for authors or anything else, right? And now I will create instance of Hono, and here I'm using Hono.route or app.route to declare that all my routes for books are going to be defined under the books route here. Now we export the route, and then let's take a look at the books route. We define the base path here. We need to remove the path in the route for books itself. Otherwise, it's going to be duplicated. So let's take care of that. Okay, and now the main file where we were serving our API is going to import the app that we have in this index file. So let's do that. There it is. Before we continue, let's give it a try to make sure that things are working as expected. Make sure that my API is still running, and yep, everything is looking good. So that is a little refactor that was needed to get started with this. And now to start working with RPC with our Hono API, we need to make a couple of changes here. If we look at the documentation, we see that we need to export the type of our Hono app, which is commonly called app type, or just the routes that we want to make available in the client from the server code. So to do that, from our index routes, now we can create a type, which is going to be type of our app instance of Hono right here. So to get the right type inference at the moment of building our API types and then exporting those types to the UI, we need to chain our handlers so the types are always inferred. There are more details in the Hono documentation website, but basically it looks like this. First of all, let's move this course handler to the index so we don't have to manually add it everywhere. And now I'm going to go start chaining all the handlers, and it's just removing the books.route and keeping it like that. So now we have only one books route, and then get, and then another get, and then .post, .put, .delete, and we continue to add more as we need it. Remove this here, so we have one line less. This is not needed anymore in books. That takes care of that. Now we need to work on the next step, which is our build script. Right now, if we run the build script in our API, pm run build, we see that the tsconfig is just transpiling everything to JavaScript. And we don't want that. We just want to export the types so they can be consumed by the UI. Let's add a dist folder to our git ignore, so we don't have to keep track of that. Then in package.json, my build script is going to remove all the contents of the dist folder and then build. So it regenerates every time. We need to modify our tsconfig file so the build actually generates types. Let's add declaration true, emit declaration only to true. I'm going to include the routes index file that I have here, src routes index.ts. Let's give it a try again. If we run build, again, we take a look at the generated dist folder, and this time it's just the types, and also books because index requires some code from books. But here is when things are starting to get interesting, because our books type now has definition for the routes, for the methods, for the outputs, and later we're going to add definition and validation for the inputs too. Now that we did that, we can make it so the UI uses these declarations. So before I forget, in package.json for our API, I'm going to add an export definition. And we're going to say that when we use our API/routes, we're going to refer to the routes index file, like that. To have a better name for our API package, we can also change it here, and we can call it books/API. And now we're going to take this book API name and use it in the package.json for the UI. So let's do that. Package.json, and here in dependencies, now we can add that. And since we're using workspaces, we can link it like so. Actually, we don't need this S here. Linked workspace package. I need to do this pnpm install, which I guess makes sense. Anyway, let's go to where we are handling data for the UI here in books. And now we need a couple of things. If we look at the Hono documentation, we can see now we can import the app type, and also we need to use Hono client to generate our client based on the types that we've just generated. But we haven't installed Hono client in the UI, so let's do that. Let's import our app type from books API/routes and import Hono client from Hono/client. We can declare our client with Hono client using our base URL. What am I missing here? Oh yeah, this is a type, of course. So now if we do client oh, something's wrong here. I'm not getting the autocomplete, and I think it is because the app type is actually is not returning the definitions correctly. So let's fix that. Oh yeah, so I did the chaining mechanism in the book's route, right? But in index I didn't. So gotta fix that. Let's do it this way. And now if I hover here on tab type, we can get the definitions that we were seeing before in the books types. So let's go back to our UI file, the one that defines all the API calls. And now if I do client dot, I get books, right? We have a books API. And then we have get, post, URL, book ID, etc. So let's go ahead and maybe replace this API call here for get. Let's do const request await, and that's it. The good thing now is that we get the types for the response, and we cannot commit a mistake if we, for example, mistype something in between here in our API calls or anything like that. We have types now, which is pretty nice. We can also go ahead and replace this one, submit book, And I'm going to comment all of this so you can see the difference between both mechanisms. Post, and this method takes the JSON type, or JSON object should I say. Now I can go ahead and try that. Some new title, because really I have no idea what to write now. Some new author, and let's say 2022. And there it is. So now it's posting, same idea, everything's working fine, but this is not perfect yet. If I happen to add something else like color, we are not getting any like type safety at the moment for sending values. So if I say red, I'm not getting any feedback here. So we are going to go ahead and fix that now. To add validation to our Zod API, we're going to use zValidator from Hono. And if we look at the documentation here, we can see that the way it works is you use this zValidator function and you give it a Zod schema. Here we have a handler for a post endpoint on author. Over here we have the handler, and in between both we have this zValidator being passed, and we can validate a JSON in the body or a parameter that comes in the URL or both. This example is creating the schema manually, so we can do this in a way that's a little bit better with drizzle-zod, which is this one here. And the difference with this one is that we can create a Zod schema from a Drizzle ORM schema, which makes things more convenient and easier to maintain as we continue to make changes to our database. In other words, we are going to need Zod, zValidator, and drizzle-zod in our API. So I'm going to go ahead and install those three packages. I have my command ready here. pnpm install in my API package drizzle-zod, zod, and Hono zValidator, like that. Okay, now in our API package, I am going to add my schemas next to the database schema file. So let's create an index file. Let's go ahead and create a schema for when we create a book in the database. With create insert schema, we can pass the books table and we can call this create book schema, and now I can export this and use it in the books route. In the books route, I will make use of zValidator when I post something. So right here, zValidator, and I want to say that I want to validate the JSON body with create book schema that I created before. So I'm going to import that too. And this is in the database index, and that's it. So now the cool thing that happens is that before I was just blindly reading the input that was being handled over from the UI in the request body. But now when we look at the request, there is this valid method. And here we can say I need to get the valid response from the JSON. So right now when we look at the result from this valid output, let's call data just to have something here. We actually are getting the types from the validation, which is great. And now instead of just using this body with an any type or like no type at all, we can read this, or we can even like destruct the fields. So we have author, title, year, and we can just pass them all here. So this takes care of the create book schema. And now since we have our RPC already set up, if we go back to the UI, we see that we're getting a TypeScript error here because validation that we just implemented does not support a field called color. We can remove this. The next step will be to take care of this type that we have here, that we created couple of videos ago manually with this book schema. So we can take care of that. We can actually go to the schemas, the schema types that we have here. And instead, what we can do is create a new type. But this time we need a type that can give us all the fields that a book can have, right? So apart from creating the book schema, we can also export the actual type from the book schema. And in this case, if we infer the type of create book schema, we can see that for this case, we only are getting title, year, and author. We need to find a way to create a type that includes also the ID. To do so, we can create another schema. We can call just book schema, and this is going to be from select schema. We can take a look at the type, and here we see that we have the title, year, author, and all of that. But right now we are not exporting that through the monorepo. So let's take a look at the exports here. Let's add another one for schemas, and this one points to db/index. So now we are exporting the schemas. If we go back to the book form where we were manually creating this schema, we can just get rid of this. This is going to be book schemas that comes from our API. So there you have it. Now we have the schema directly created from the database. Okay, now we need to fix a bunch of things here because there's going to be a lot of discrepancies with our types that we've been passing left and right in our mutations. That's going to be the next step. Instead of relying on a manually exported type here, and since we are importing this from our API, we can go to the definition and we use uppercase when we are exporting a type, so we can differentiate the type from the Zod schema. Let's get rid of this line 2, this export type, because everything is going to come from the API itself. So now we have our book as a book schema type. Use form needs the type again, so we can just remove all of this and use the book schema type. Zod resolver needs the schema, not the type. We move forward now for our mutations. Our submit book, it was reading the previously exported book type from book form. We don't need that anymore, it's not there. So when we submit a book, we are going to pass a create book schema because book schema has an ID. When we create an item, we don't have an ID. So let's use this type instead. Let's clean this. We don't need that anymore. When we update, we're going to need an update book schema. Let's go and add that now. We have the type here. Just going to copy this and update accordingly and call this date book schema. Same for the type, but with an uppercase at the beginning. In our update book now, instead of destructuring the ID from the book, what we're going to do is take 2 parameters. One is going to be an ID, which is going to be number, and then the book, which is going to be update book schema. That takes care of that. Now we also need to update or validate the API for update, so we can rewrite this as we did above for fetching and submit. So let's do that now. Let's go back to the API. Routes here in put, we are going to use a validation for the query param and a validation for the JSON in the body for the request. So first, let's do JSON validator on with update book schema, and then we need another validator for the book ID. I will add it to our schemas here. I just need the ID from the select, and one way to do that is by using the create select schema with books table, and then I'm going to omit everything except the ID. So resulting schema is just going to contain the ID. And we can call this ID schema. And then when we want to export the type, great. Now going back to the validator here, I'm going to add another one for this time for the parent, and this is going to use ID schema. If we look at this, where we were manually grabbing fields both from the URL params and the JSON in the body, now we can do C request valid, and now we have two options, JSON and param. So for param, let's rename this to ID in this structure in case we have more parameters coming in the URL. And now we will do the same for our JSON. So dot valid JSON, and we can just call this data. And as you can see here, the fields can be undefined if we happen to update only the title, only the year, only the author, or everything at the same time. Here we need to rename this to ID, and that's it. Now let's also validate delete endpoint. I'm gonna copy this same validator for the schema ID, rename this to ID, and now same idea here. Just gonna copy paste and rename book ID to ID. We can also validate the get endpoint that also needs an ID. I'm gonna copy the same validator for the ID schema, and then this has to be here, not in the get all. Now we have our ID, and that's it. So now all our endpoints are going to validate as expected based on the schemas that we defined earlier. Here we don't need this line anymore. Let's remove that. Okay, back to the UI. Our update API call in the UI now can be rewritten with our client. So we have books, and this time we need to read the ID in order to do a put request. And now we can pass a couple of things. Since the API handler is now validating for the parameter and JSON object, we need to assign those here. So the param is going to be the ID, and then JSON is going to be book. Issue here with the validation, and that is because parameter needs to be an object, and now we can pass the ID. And here, since ID is a number, but the parameter is requesting a string, we can parse this with a toString, and that will take care of that. This needs to be awaited. And now let's re-import the delete endpoint with the client. Now I'm going to move on to the book form component and re-implement the correct types. Right now we're looking at, we're defining an ID default value here, but when we create or edit a book, we don't need to handle that. So we can just remove that. Also, we need to account for the year value. So let's add it here. Okay, for now we can have as a default value 2025. Something else to notice here is that this book schema uses an ID. So instead we're going to use create book schema that takes only title, year, and author. For the Zod resolver, I'm going to use the schema that comes from this type like that. And now I'm going to update this consubmit handler. The type that we're going to use for this is going to be create book schema because it has title, year, and author, and all of them are needed in this type. And instead of checking for values.id, we're just going to check for the presence of book. So if we're passing a book to the component, we are editing or updating. If we're not passing a book, we will be creating. Let's give it a try and see how things are looking on the UI side. First, I will try to add a book, some test values. We see that the request is going through, no problem. So when we delete, we are seeing this issue here, and yeah, it's giving me a Zod error because the input ID is expected to be a number but it received a string, and that is because our schema validation for the ID schema is taking in an integer or number, and routes, HTTP routes and parameters in an endpoint they come as string. So this time, instead of creating a very specific schema based on the books table, and since we only need an ID, what I'm going to do is create a Zod schema that will coerce the type ID into a number. I'm going to refresh and run delete here. That's it. Now it takes, now it works fine. And I'm seeing this strange output here because I think I forgot to add returning. So it returns the removed or deleted book. Something that we need to address for too is that now if I submit something, this is going through. So we have types in place, but we don't have validation in place. Before we had the validations in the front end with a Zod schema. Now we need to implement those validations in the API side in our schema definitions here. Since we're using a combination of Zod and drizzle-zod, we can add a validation by writing it here when we create the schema. So for example, we can say that for title, I'm going to say that the minimum length is going to be 5, and then the message can be the title should be at least 5 characters, just to say something. And we can continue adding more to other fields. We're going to set a maximum of 2030 because we are in 2025. Isn't that too far out? So now when we create a book, these validation messages are going to show up. Let's remove this and try to add a book. Great. So now the validation that we're running in the API side with the errors are also validating the input form out here. So this validation is also going to be needed when we update, but if we copy and paste everything is not a good idea because we'll need to manually modify validations depending on what we need, which might be the use case, but we can also refactor this into its own validation object. So let's say that it's going to be book validation, and we need to manually pass the type because now we are outside of the scope of insert schema. So I see that this is a zValidator string. For year we have Zod int. Okay. And now we can place with book validation, and same for update book schema, we pass the same validation. Of course, if you need a custom validation for when you're creating and another custom one when you are updating, you can do it too. That's totally fine. Now let's give it a try. If I try to edit this value and I say that the year is going to be 2050, we see another error, but this is on the UI side. And this happens because HTML forms by default take strings, and this has to be converted into a number before the submit happens. To fix that, in our book form, let's go to year, and we're going to do a couple of things now. Type number, and then also we're going to do a value conversion, or value parse, should I say, where we're going to access field.onChange to effectively update our React form value. And here we're going to parse int or number target value, because this one comes as a string, but we need it to be an integer. So let's go back. And now if I update to 2018, that should be okay. There it is. And what if I do 2031? Yep, I'm getting the validation that we had before. Sweet. I'm gonna wrap up this video here. It's getting kind of long. We finalized our end-to-end type safe implementation with Hono RPC plus error handling. So in the next video and last video of the series, we will work on some minor improvements for user experience, like adding some alerts for successfully created books, errors, warnings, etc. See you there.